They warned me before I ever saw the seat. Not formally, not with alarms or written decrees, but in the way veterans warn recruits, quietly, urgently, as if saying the words too loudly might draw attention. Every male who had spent more than a cycle aboard the Concord Station delivered the same advice in different voices and different species accents. Keep your distance, keep your eyes forward, and whatever you do, do not engage the one they call the princess. The title carried weight here. Titles always did. On Concord Station, rank was currency, lineage was leverage, and hierarchy was the language everyone spoke fluently. Humanity was still learning the grammar. We were new, tolerated more for curiosity than trust, allowed a narrow strip of presence among civilizations that had been old when our species was still painting walls with ash. I was here as an observer, officially a cultural liaison, unofficially a test. Could a human sit among them without breaking something important? The first week suggested the answer was no. The station itself felt like a compromise that had gone too far. Gravity shifted by corridor, lights adjusted to eyes that saw different spectra, and the air tasted faintly metallic no matter where you went. Males of a dozen species passed me daily, some armored, some robed, some barely contained by their own skin. Most ignored me. A few watched as if waiting for me to prove a theory. It was the guards who spoke first. One was a scaled biped assigned to transit security, his voice gravelly from a throat not meant for human frequencies. He blocked my path one cycle and studied me with eyes that didn't blink. "You are human," he said, "not a question." "Yes." "Then remember this," he continued. "Proximity is not neutral. Some beings alter the balance simply by existing near you. The princess is one of them." Later, an archivist, thin, many-limbed, and old enough that his movements seemed rehearsed, echoed the same warning while filing star charters. "Others lose themselves," he told me, tapping a data slate with a trembling appendage. "Ambition, loyalty, even identity. They believe they choose obedience. They do not." Even the station's central intelligence, a synthesized male voice that mediated disputes and controlled life support, advised avoidance in its own careful phrasing. Statistical models indicate a high probability of irreversible psychological realignment following unshielded interaction. I listened. I nodded. I did what humans have always done when confronted with ancient fear. I assumed exaggeration. By the time I saw the princess for the first time, I already knew not to look. The lecture hall was one of the few shared spaces designed to force coexistence. Tiered seating curved around a central dais, each level accommodating different anatomies. Attendance was mandatory for delegates, observers, and anyone whose species was being discussed, which meant most of us, most days. I arrived early, as humans tended to do, and took a seat near the middle where the gravity felt stable and the exits were visible. Around me, the hall filled slowly. Conversations hummed in translated fragments. A trio of armored males argued softly over trade routes. A tall avian delegate folded his wings with visible discomfort. Across the aisle, a group of aides stood instead of sitting, as if the furniture itself were beneath them. Then the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. No doors slammed, no lights dimmed. The sound simply thinned, like pressure dropping before a storm. Bodies stiffened. Conversations died mid-syllable. Males who had been arguing a moment earlier went still, eyes unfocused, posture subtly altered, as if an invisible hand had adjusted them. I felt none of it. I noticed the space beside me empty, though I was certain it hadn't been moments before. The seat's surface rippled, adapting to a form that hadn't yet arrived. A presence settled there, close enough that the air between us felt occupied. I did not turn my head. "You were warned," a voice said, calm and precise, carried without effort through the ambient noise. I recognized the cadence immediately. This was not a question. It was a statement delivered by someone accustomed to being obeyed. "So they tell me," I replied, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. Silence followed. Not the heavy silence of threat, but the attentive silence of interest. I risked a glance then, just enough to acknowledge, without staring. The princess did not conform to the grotesque myths whispered in corridors. There was no excess, No monstrous exaggeration. Everything about the figure beside me was controlled: movement, posture, even stillness. Guards stood at a respectful distance, males whose eyes never quite focused on their charge. "You do not avert your gaze quickly enough," the princess observed. "I'm still learning the customs," I said. "Ours included." That earned another pause. I could feel attention ripple outward as nearby delegates realized what was happening. Some leaned away from us instinctively. Others froze, caught between protocol and fear. No one intervened. "You are human," the princess said again, as if testing the word. "Yes." "There is no compulsion in your tone." "There usually isn't," I answered. "If there were, I'd be worried." Something shifted then, not in the room, but in the space between us. I became acutely aware that this was the moment the warnings had been trying to prevent. A line crossed not by aggression, but by proximity. Whatever influence the princess exerted, it had failed to take hold, and the failure was being noticed. "You should not be here," the princess said quietly. "Others would already be less." "I don't feel smaller," I replied. "Just curious." For the first time, I sensed uncertainty. Not weakness, never that, but recalculation. The princess studied me as one might study an anomaly in a trusted equation, something that refused to resolve no matter how often it was run. The hall's central dais activated, calling the session to order. Around us, delegates slowly resumed motion, though many cast glances our way. The princess did not move from the seat beside me. "Then listen," the princess said as the lights shifted. "And remain as you are. I would see how long that lasts." As the first speaker began, I realized the warnings had all shared one fatal flaw. They assumed the danger was one-sided. Sitting there, unbowed and unaltered, I understood that something far older and far larger than me had just encountered resistance, and that it had chosen not to move away. The session proceeded, but the galaxy's balance had already changed, quietly, with an empty seat filled and a human who did not kneel. The princess returned the next cycle, and the one after that. No announcement preceded the arrival. No protocol changed. Yet every time the seat beside mine filled, the air around us tightened with expectation. Males who had once tolerated my presence now avoided my eyes. Others watched me with something closer to alarm than curiosity, as if I were a variable they had failed to account for and could no longer ignore. The princess spoke little at first. When addressed by others, the replies were brief, economical, and final. When speaking to me, the cadence altered, not softer but less absolute. It was as though the authority that saturated every word loosened its grip in my direction and waited to see if it would be missed. "You do not change," the princess observed during the third session, gaze fixed forward. "Most do." "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to change into," I said. "No one's given me instructions." "That is the point." Around us, the hall listened. I felt it in the way bodies leaned subtly closer, the way guards adjusted their stance. The princess's attention was a gravity well, and the fact that I remained upright within it had become a problem that refused to stay contained. Between sessions, warnings intensified. A senior delegate from a merchant coalition cornered me near the transit lifts, his voice pitched low despite the absence of anyone nearby. "You are interfering with equilibrium," he said. "Do you understand how many agreements depend on his presence remaining unquestioned?" "I'm just sitting in a chair," I replied. "That chair is not neutral." The princess addressed the matter directly soon after, as if responding to a signal only the two of us could perceive. "You are being discussed," he said. "Not as an individual, as a phenomenon." "Congratulations to me," I said. "I've always wanted to be abstract." "You resist alignment," the princess continued, unbothered by my tone. "There is no submission, no reflexive deference. Even defiance usually carries emotional markers. Yours does not." I considered that. We argue with ourselves constantly. Authority never has a single voice in our heads. Maybe there's nothing for you to tune into. That earned my first direct look. The princess turned fully then, studying my face with an intensity that would have unmade others. I felt pressure, Yes, but it's scattered instead of concentrating, like water poured onto broken stone. Your mind is noisy, the princess said. Occupational hazard. Noise should yield chaos. Instead, it produces resistance. I shrugged. We survived our own leaders. Everything after that was practice. The next revelation came not as confession, but as correction. A junior council member, too young, too eager, attempted to assert authority during a trade dispute. The princess silenced him without raising a voice. The effect was immediate and devastating. The male faltered, posture collapsing inward, words dissolving into breath. He left the chamber diminished, escorted by guards who would not meet his eyes. I waited for the aftershock. It never came. The princess noticed. You felt nothing, he said quietly once the session ended. I felt sorry for him, I replied. That's not the same thing. The silence that followed was different. Not tension, but recalibration. Something ancient was being forced to consider an exception it had never needed before. You are not immune, the princess said at last. You are incompatible. That sounds worse. It is rarer. From that cycle onward, the guards no longer tried to position themselves between us. Observers recorded more than they spoke. Messages arrived from human command, carefully worded and entirely unhelpful, advising vigilance without offering explanation. I complied in the only way I knew how, by continuing to be myself. The princess began asking questions then, not of humanity's military or technology, but of its contradictions. How we could follow leaders we distrusted. How we could dismantle hierarchies only to rebuild them differently. How we tolerated dissent without fracturing entirely. We argue, I said. Then we argue about why we argued. It never really ends. And yet you endure. Barely, I said. But it's ours. The princess was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, the words carried something new. Not authority. Not command. Curiosity, stripped of expectation. If others were like you, he said, my presence would be unnecessary. That doesn't sound like a threat, I replied. It sounds like a possibility. The final test came without warning. During a full assembly, with every major species represented, the princess extended his influence outward, not in force, but in invitation. The room shifted, as it always did. Males straightened, eyes dulled, wills aligned. I did not. The pressure washed over me and broke apart, lost in the familiar chaos of competing thoughts, doubts, memories, and questions that made up my mind. I stayed seated. I stayed myself. When the influence withdrew, the hall erupted, not in sound, but in realization. The princess turned to me, and for the first time, there was no certainty in his expression. You remain, he said. I told you, I replied. I don't kneel easily. The princess inclined his head, just enough to acknowledge a truth that could no longer be denied. Then you will remain beside me, he said, until I understand what that means. As the assembly resumed around us, I understood that the conflict had shifted. It was no longer about avoidance or curiosity. It was about a power that failed and a species that did not bend, and the consequences that would follow. The consequences arrived quietly, as most irreversible things do. Schedules shifted first. Council sessions delayed until I was present, not by decree but by habit, as if the chamber itself had learned to wait. Delegates who once ignored me now measured their words, glancing between the princess and me as though triangulating an unseen force. No one spoke of it openly. Acknowledging the anomaly would require admitting fear, and fear was a currency few here could afford to spend. Human command broke its silence soon after. The message was brief, compressed through layers of diplomatic caution, and signed by a senior male officer whose name carried weight back home. Maintain composure. Avoid escalation. Do not invite dependency. The irony was not lost on me. I was being asked to avoid influence while sitting beside the most influential being in the chamber. The princess noticed my distraction. Your superiors are uneasy, he said, not looking at me. They're always uneasy, I replied. It's how they know they're still relevant. You are altering perceptions, the princess continued. Not through intention, through presence. I didn't come here to lead anything, I said. I came to observe. And yet, he said, empires observe you now. The truth emerged in fragments, never delivered all at once. Between sessions, during the long pauses where others hesitated to interrupt us, the princess spoke of a stability that was no longer stable. His kind had ruled for generations through alignment rather than violence, shaping coalitions by ensuring obedience felt voluntary. It had worked until it hadn't. Younger species adapt, he said. They grow resistant. Not immune, but uncertain. Doubt spreads faster than control. Sounds familiar, I said. You represent an endpoint, he replied. A civilization formed without a singular axis of authority. Your kind does not collapse when leaders fail. You replace them. Sometimes, I said. Sometimes we just argue louder. That is resilience, the princess said. Disorder that corrects itself. The council chambers felt smaller after that. Whispers followed us through corridors. A coalition representative openly accused the princess of favoritism. Another suggested containment of me. The proposal died quickly, not from outrage, but from calculation. No one wanted to test whether removing the human would restore the old balance or shatter it completely. The princess made his position clear during a closed session attended only by senior males of the dominant factions. I was not meant to be there. I stayed anyway. This human will not be restricted, the princess said, voice level, authority unquestioned. He is not an asset. He is a mirror. A mirror can be shattered, one delegate replied. Then you will bleed on the shards, the princess said calmly. After that, the arguments changed shape. Offers replaced threats. Alliances were floated, framed as partnerships, but weighted with expectation. I declined each in turn. Not dramatically. Simply, consistently. I don't belong to anyone, I said when pressed. Neither does my species. The princess watched these refusals with something like approval. You disappoint them, he said once. I'm used to it. You disappoint me as well, he added. But in a way that clarifies. The admission came near the end of a long cycle when the station's lights dimmed to simulate night for those who required it. The chamber was empty save for guards at a distance, and the two of us seated, as we had been from the beginning. My empire is failing, the princess said. The words were unadorned, stripped of ceremony. I did not respond immediately. Some truths demanded space. Not from rebellion, he continued. From irrelevance. Control loses meaning when it must be enforced. What happens when it ends? I asked. Chaos, he said. Or something new. He turned to me then, the weight of his attention focused but no longer oppressive. I did not choose you at random. Humanity stands where others will follow. You prove that proximity does not require submission. I met his gaze. I won't replace you, I said. And I won't help you rule differently. I know, he replied. That is why this works. The final session of the cycle drew every faction, every observer, every male who mattered. The princess took his seat beside me as always. The room stilled, waiting for a familiar pressure that did not come. Instead, the princess spoke without influence, without compulsion. He addressed the council as equals, not subjects. The effect was immediate and destabilizing. Confusion rippled outward, followed by something more dangerous than fear. Possibility. You withdraw, a delegate said, stunned. I step aside, the princess corrected. Authority that cannot tolerate resistance is already dead. All eyes turned to me then, as if expecting a declaration, a claim, a justification. I offered none. I simply remained seated, human and unbowed. As the session dissolved into urgent debate, I understood that the conflict had crossed a threshold. An empire was loosening its grip, not because it had been challenged by force, but because it had encountered something it could not bend. Whatever followed would not be clean or quiet. And the galaxy would never again mistake humanity for something simple. The aftermath was not the collapse many had predicted, nor the swift reordering others had hoped for. It was slower, more unsettling. Without the princess's influence pressing down on them, the council discovered the weight of their own choices. Sessions stretched longer. Decisions fractured. Reformed, fractured again. Authority no longer arrived fully formed. It had to be negotiated, defended, earned. The princess did not retreat into isolation. He remained present, visible but altered. Guards stood farther back now, less rigid, their attention no longer sharpened by compulsion. When the princess spoke, males listened because they chose to, and the difference unsettled them more than silence ever had. "You have given them uncertainty," I said during one of our quieter intervals. "I have returned it," he replied. "They lived without it for too long." Human command requested my assessment. I sent them the truth, stripped of flourish. The galaxy was not falling apart. It was learning friction. They responded with caution and relief in equal measure, advising continued observation. For once, that aligned perfectly with my intentions. Not all welcomed the change. A bloc of older powers attempted to resurrect the old structure through force of consensus, leaning on habit and fear. The effort collapsed within a single cycle. Without alignment to smooth over dissent, their authority revealed itself as hollow. Smaller species withdrew. Agreements unraveled. No one filled the vacuum immediately. The princess watched these developments with an expression I had learned to recognize as reflection. "They believed control was stability," he said. "They mistook stillness for peace." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "they must speak to one another." The decisive moment came during the first assembly held without enforced hierarchy. No ceremonial seating. No elevated dais. Just a circular chamber and a deliberate absence of pressure. Voices overlapped. Arguments flared and cooled. For hours, nothing resolved. Then something did. A minor trade accord passed, not because it was commanded, but because enough parties found it acceptable. It was imperfect. It would require revision. No one pretended otherwise. Yet when it concluded, the chamber did not feel diminished. It felt awake. The princess observed in silence. When the session ended, he did not rise immediately. Neither did I. "You will be remembered," he said at last. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "You remained," he said. That was sufficient. He stood then and faced the chamber, his voice carrying without effort but without force. "From this point forward, my presence binds no one. Those who align with me will do so openly. Those who do not will remain free." No challenge followed. No one dared frame obedience as tradition anymore. Later, when the station lights dimmed and the corridors emptied, we sat as we always had. The seat beside mine remained occupied, not by necessity, but by choice. "You were warned to avoid me," the princess said. "Frequently. And yet you did not." "I don't believe danger comes from proximity," I said. "It comes from surrender." He considered that. "My kind built an empire on the belief that surrender was natural." "Nothing about thinking beings is natural," I replied. "We're all improvising." For the first time since I'd known him, the princess allowed something close to amusement to surface. "Then the galaxy will improvise as well." The next cycle brought departures and arrivals, new delegates, new tensions. Humanity's status shifted quietly from curiosity to reference point. Not leaders. Not conquerors. Something more difficult to categorize. As for the princess, he continued to sit beside me when it suited him, and elsewhere when it did not. The choice mattered more than the position. Others noticed. Some followed. Some resisted. All adapted. On the day my assignment was scheduled to end, I stood to leave the chamber for the last time. The princess remained seated. "You will return," he said, not as a command. "Probably," I said. "We have a habit of coming back to places that challenge us." He inclined his head, a gesture no longer freighted with dominance. "Then this seat will remain unclaimed." I paused, looking at the empty space beside him, understanding finally the meaning others had missed. The princess had never been the threat. Neither had humanity been the solution. The danger had always been a universe built on unquestioned obedience, And the moment someone chose to sit beside power without kneeling, it learned how fragile it truly was.